Section 1 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts. Recording by Sandra. Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. Section 1. Cross Purposes. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, the Queen of Fairyland, finding her own subjects far too well behaved to be amusing, took a sudden longing to have a mortal or two at her court. So after looking about her for some time, she fixed upon 2 to bring to Fairyland. But how were they to be brought? "Please, your Majesty," said at last the daughter of the Prime Minister, "I will bring the girl." The speaker, whose name was Peaseblossom after her great-great-grandmother, looked so graceful and hung her head so apologetically that the Queen said at once, "How will you manage it, Peaseblossom? I will open the road before her and close it behind her." "I have heard that you have pretty ways of doing things, so you may try." The court happened to be held in an open forest glade of smooth turf, upon which there was just one mole heap. As soon as the Queen had given her permission to Peaseblossom, up through the mole heap came the head of a goblin, which cried out, "Please, your Majesty, I will bring the boy." "You!" exclaimed the Queen. "How will you do it?" The goblin began to wriggle himself out of the earth as if he had been a snake, and the whole world his skin, till the court was convulsed with laughter. As soon as he got free, he began to roll over and over in every possible manner, rotatory and cylindrical, all at once, until he reached the wood. The courtiers followed, holding their sides, so that the Queen was left sitting upon her throne in solitary state. When they reached the wood, the goblin, whose name was Toadstool, was nowhere to be seen. While they were looking for him, out popped his head from the mole heap again, with the words, "So, your Majesty?" "You have taken your own time to answer," said the Queen, laughing. "And my own way too, eh, your Majesty?" rejoined Toadstool, grinning. "No doubt. Well, you may try." And the goblin, making as much of a bow as he could with only half his neck above ground, disappeared under it. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. Cross Purposes. Chapter 2. No mortal, or fairy either, can tell where Fairyland begins and where it ends. But somewhere on the borders of Fairyland there was a nice country village, in which lived some nice country people. Alice was the daughter of the squire, a pretty, good-natured girl, whom her friends called fairy-like and others called silly. One rosy summer evening, when the wall opposite her bed was flaked all over with rosiness, she threw herself down on her bed and lay gazing at the wall. The rose colour sank through her eyes and dyed her brain, and she began to feel as if she were reading a storybook. She thought she was looking at a western sea, with the waves all red with sunset. But when the colour died out, Alice gave a sigh to see how commonplace the wall grew. "I wish it was always sunset," she said, half aloud. "I don't like grey things." "I will take you where the sun is always setting if you like, Alice," said a sweet tiny voice near her. She looked down on the coverlet of the bed, and there, looking up at her, stood a lovely little creature. It seemed quite natural that the little lady should be there, for many things we never could believe have only to happen, and then there is nothing strange about them. She was dressed in white, with a cloak of sunset red, the colours of the sweetest of sweet peas. On her head was a crown of twisted tendrils, with a little gold beetle in front. "Are you a fairy?" said Alice. "Yes. Will you go with me to the sunset?" "Yes, I will." When Alice proceeded to rise, she found that she was no bigger than the fairy, and when she stood up on the counterpane, the bed looked like a great hall with a painted ceiling. As she walked towards Peas Blossom, she stumbled several times over the tufts that made the pattern, but the fairy took her by the hand and led her towards the foot of the bed. Long before they reached it, however, Alice saw that the fairy was a tall, slender lady, and that she herself was quite her own size. What she had taken for tufts on the counterpane were really bushes of furze and broom and heather on the side of a slope. "Where are we?" asked Alice. "Going on," answered the fairy. Alice, not liking the reply, said, "I want to go home." "Goodbye then," answered the fairy. Alice looked round. A wide hilly country lay all about them. She could not even tell from what quarter they had come. "I must go with you, I see," she said. Before they reached the bottom, they were walking over the loveliest meadow grass. A little stream went cantering down beside them, without channel or bank, sometimes running between the blades, sometimes sweeping the grass all one way under it. And it made a great babbling for such a little stream and such a smooth course. Gradually the slope grew gentler, and the stream flowed more softly and spread out wider. At length they came to a wood of long, straight poplars growing out of the water, for the stream ran into the wood, and there stretched out into a lake. Alice thought they could go no further, but Peas Blossom led her straight on, and they walked through. It was now dark, but everything under the water gave out a pale, quiet light. There were deep pools here and there, but there was no mud or frogs or water lizards or eels. All the bottom was pure, lovely grass, brilliantly green. Down the banks of the pools she saw, all under water, primroses and violets and pimpernels. Any flower she wished to see, she had only to look for, and she was sure to find it. When a pool came in their way, the fairy swam, and Alice swam by her, and when they got out they were quite dry, though the water was as delightfully wet as water should be. Besides the trees, tall, splendid lilies grew out of it, and hollyhocks and irises and sword plants, and many other long-stemmed flowers. From every leaf and petal of these, from every branch tip and tendril, dropped bright water. It gathered slowly at each point, but the points were so many that there was a constant musical plashing of diamond rain upon the still surface of the lake. As they went on, the moon rose and threw a pale mist of light over the whole, and the diamond drops turned to half-liquid pearls, and round every tree-top was a halo of moonlight, and the water went to sleep, and the flowers began to dream. "Look," said the fairy, "those lilies are just dreaming themselves into a child's sleep. I can see them smiling. This is the place out of which go the things that appear to children every night." "Is this dreamland then?" asked Alice. "If you like," answered the fairy. "How far am I from home?" "The farther you go, the nearer home you are." Then the fairy lady gathered a bundle of poppies and gave it to Alice. The next deep pool that they came to, she told her to throw it in. Alice did so, and following it, laid her head upon it. That moment she began to sink. Down and down she went, till at last she felt herself lying on the long, thick grass at the bottom of the pool, with the poppies under her head and the clear water high over it. Up through it she saw the moon, whose bright face looked sleepy too, disturbed only by the little ripples of the rain from the tall flowers on the edges of the pool. She fell fast asleep, and all night dreamed about home. End of Chapter 2. Section 3 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. Cross Purposes, Chapter 3. Richard, which is name enough for a fairy story, was the son of a widow in Alice's village. He was so poor that he did not find himself generally welcome, so he hardly went anywhere, but read books at home and waited upon his mother. His manners, therefore, were shy and sufficiently awkward to give an unfavourable impression to those who looked at outsides. Alice would have despised him, but he never came near enough for that. Now Richard had been saving up his few pence in order to buy an umbrella for his mother, for the winter would come, and the one she had was almost torn to ribbons. One bright summer evening, when he thought umbrellas must be cheap, he was walking across the marketplace to buy one. There, in the middle of it, stood an odd-looking little man, actually selling umbrellas. Here was a chance for him. When he drew nearer, he found that the little man, while vaunting his umbrellas to the skies, was asking such absurdly small prices for them that no one would venture to buy one. He had opened and laid them all out at full stretch on the marketplace, about 25 of them, stick downwards, like little tents, and he stood beside haranguing the people. But he would not allow one of the crowd to touch his umbrellas. As soon as his eye fell upon Richard, he changed his tone and said, "Well, as nobody seems inclined to buy, I think, my dear umbrellas, we had better be going home." Whereupon the umbrellas got up, with some difficulty, and began hobbling away. The people stared at each other with open mouths, for they saw that what they had taken for a lot of umbrellas was in reality a flock of black geese. A great turkey cock went gobbling behind them, driving them all down a lane towards the forest. Richard thought with himself, "There is more in this than I can account for, but an umbrella that could lay eggs would be a very jolly umbrella." So by the time the people were beginning to laugh at each other, Richard was halfway down the lanes at the heels of the geese. There he stooped and caught one of them, but instead of a goose, he had a huge hedgehog in his hands, which he dropped in dismay. Whereupon it waddled away, a goose as before, and the whole of them began cackling and hissing in a way that he could not mistake. For the turkey cock he gobbled and gabbled and choked himself, and got right again in the most ridiculous manner. In fact, he seemed sometimes to forget that he was a turkey, and laughed like a fool. All at once, with a simultaneous long-necked hiss, they flew into the wood, and the turkey after them. But Richard soon got up with them again, and found them all hanging by their feet from the trees, in 2 rows, one on each side of the path, while the turkey was walking on. Him Richard followed, but the moment he reached the middle of the suspended geese, from every side arose the most frightful hisses, and their necks grew longer and longer, till there were nearly 30 broad bills close to his head, blowing in his face, in his ears, and at the back of his neck. But the turkey, looking round and seeing what was going on, turned and walked back. When he reached the place, he looked up at the first and gobbled at him in the wildest manner. That goose grew silent and dropped from the tree. Then he went to the next, and so on, till he had gobbled them all off the trees, one after another. But when Richard expected to see them go after the turkey, there was nothing there but a flock of huge mushrooms and puffballs. "I have had enough of this," thought Richard. "I will go home again." "Go home, Richard," said a voice close to him. Looking down, he saw, instead of the turkey, the most comical-looking little man he had ever seen. "Go home, Master Richard," repeated he, grinning. "Not for your bidding," answered Richard. "Come on then, Master Richard." "Nor that either, without a good reason." "I will give you such an umbrella for your mother." I don't take presents from strangers." "Bless you, I'm no stranger here. Oh no, not at all." And he set off in the manner usual with him, rolling every way at once. Richard could not help laughing and following. At length, Toadstool plumped into a great hole full of water. "Served him right," thought Richard. "Served him right," bawled the goblin, crawling out again and shaking the water from him like a spaniel. "This is the very place I wanted, only I rolled too fast." However, he went on rolling again faster than before, though it was now uphill, till he came to the top of a considerable height, on which grew a number of palm trees. "Have you a knife, Richard?" said the goblin, stopping all at once, as if he had been walking quietly along, just like other people. Richard pulled out a pocket knife and gave it to the creature, who instantly cut a deep gash in one of the trees. Then he bounded to another and did the same, and so on till he had gashed them all. Richard, following him, saw that a little stream, clearer than the clearest water, began to flow from each, increasing in size the longer it flowed. Before he had reached the last, there was quite a tinkling and rustling of the little rills that ran down the stems of the palms. This grew and grew, till Richard saw that a full rivulet was flowing down the side of the hill. "Here is your knife, Richard," said the goblin, but by the time he had put it in his pocket, the rivulet had grown to a small torrent. "Now, Richard, come along," said Toadstool, and threw himself into the torrent. "I would rather have a boat," returned Richard. "Oh, you stupid!" cried Toadstool, crawling up the side of the hill, down which the stream had already carried him some distance. With every contortion that labour and difficulty could suggest, yet with incredible rapidity, he crawled to the very top of one of the trees and tore down a huge leaf which he threw on the ground, and himself after it, rebounding like a ball. He then laid the leaf on the water, held it by the stem, and told Richard to get upon it. He did so. It went down deep in the middle with his weight. Toadstool let it go, and it shot down the stream like an arrow. This began the strangest and most delightful voyage. The stream rushed careering and curveting down the hillside, bright as a diamond, and soon reached a meadow plain. The goblin rolled alongside of the boat like a bundle of weeds, but Richard rode in triumph through the low grassy country upon the back of his watery steed. It went straight as an arrow, and, strange to tell, was heaped up on the ground, like a ridge of water or a wave, only rushing on endways. It needed no channel, and turned aside for no opposition. It flowed over everything that crossed its path, like a great serpent of water, with folds fitting into all the ups and downs of the way. If a wall came in its course, it flowed against it, heaping itself up on itself till it reached the top, whence it plunged to the foot of the other side and flowed on. Soon he found that it was running gently up a grassy hill. The waves kept curling back as if the wind blew them, or as if they could hardly keep from running down again. But still the stream mounted and flowed, and the waves with it. It found it difficult, but it could do it. When they reached the top, it bore them across a heathy country, rolling over purple heather and blue harebells and delicate ferns, and tall foxgloves crowded with bells, purple and white. All the time the palm leaf curled its edges away from the water and made a delightful boat for Richard, while Toadstool tumbled along in the stream like a porpoise. At length the water began to run very fast, and went faster and faster, till suddenly it plunged them into a deep lake with a great splash, and stopped there. Toadstool went out of sight, and came up gasping and grinning, while Richard's boat tossed and heaved like a vessel in a storm at sea, but not a drop of water came in. Then the goblin began to swim and pushed and tugged the boat along, but the lake was so still and the motion so pleasant that Richard fell fast asleep. End of Section 3. Section 4 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cross Purposes, Chapter 4. When he woke, he found himself still afloat upon the broad palm leaf. He was alone in the middle of a lake, with flowers and trees growing in and out of it everywhere. The sun was just over the treetops. A drip of water from the flowers greeted him with music. The mists were dissolving away, and where the sunlight fell on the lake, the water was clear as glass. Casting his eyes downward, he saw, just beneath him, far down at the bottom, Alice drowned, as he thought. He was in the act of plunging in when he saw her eyes open, and at the same moment begin to float up. He held out his hand, but she repelled it with disdain, and swimming to a tree, sat down on a low branch, wondering how ever the poor widow's son could have found his way into fairyland. She did not like it. It was an invasion of privilege. "How did you come here, young Richard?" she asked from 6 yards off. "A goblin brought me." "Ah, I thought so. A fairy brought me." "Where is your fairy?" "Here I am," said Peaseblossom, rising slowly to the surface, just by the tree on which Alice was seated. "Where is your goblin?" retorted Alice. "Here I am," bawled Toadstool, rushing out of the water like a salmon, and casting a somersault in the air before he fell in again with a tremendous splash. His head rose again close beside Peaseblossom, who, being used to such creatures, only laughed. "Isn't he handsome?" he grinned. "Yes, very. He wants polishing, though. You could do that for yourself, you know. Shall we change?" "I don't mind. You'll find her rather silly." "That's nothing. The boy's too sensible for me." He dived and rose at Alice's feet. She shrieked with terror. The fairy floated away like a water lily towards Richard. "What a lovely creature," thought he. But hearing Alice shriek again, he said, "Don't leave Alice. She's frightened at that queer creature. I don't think there's any harm in him, though, Alice." "Oh, no, he won't hurt her," said Peaseblossom. "I'm tired of her. He's going to take her to the court, and I will take you." "I don't want to go." "But you must. You can't go home again. You don't know the way." "Richard, Richard!" cried Alice in an agony. Richard sprang from his boat and was by her side in a moment. "He pinched me!" cried Alice. Richard hit the goblin a terrible blow on the head, but it took no more effect upon him than if his head had been a round ball of India rubber. He gave Richard a furious look, however, and bawling out, "You'll repent that, Dick," vanished under the water. "Come along, Richard, make haste. He will murder you," cried the fairy. "It's all your fault," said Richard. "I won't leave Alice." Then the fairy saw it was all over with her and Toadstool, for they can do nothing with mortals against their will. So she floated away across the water in Richard's boat, holding her robe for a sail, and vanished, leaving the two alone in the lake. "You have driven away my fairy," cried Alice. "I shall never get home now. It is all your fault, you naughty young man." "I drove away the goblin," remonstrated Richard. "Will you please to sit on the other side of the tree? I wonder what my papa would say if he saw me talking to you." "Will you come to the next tree, Alice?" said Richard after a pause. Alice, who had been crying all the time that Richard was thinking, said, "I won't." Richard therefore plunged into the water without her and swam for the tree. Before he had got halfway, however, he heard Alice crying, "Richard! Richard!" This was just what he wanted, so he turned back and Alice threw herself into the water. With Richard's help she swam pretty well, and they reached the tree. "Now for the next," said Richard, and they swam to the next and then to the third. Every tree they reached was larger than the last, and every tree before them was larger still. So they swam from tree to tree till they came to one that was so large that they could not see round it. What was to be done? Clearly to climb this tree. It was a dreadful prospect for Alice, but Richard proceeded to climb, and by putting her feet where he put his, and now and then getting hold of his ankle, she managed to make her way up. There were a great many stumps where branches had withered off, and the bark was nearly as rough as a hillside, so there was plenty of foothold for them. When they had climbed a long time and were getting very tired indeed, Alice cried out, "Richard, I shall drop, I shall. Why did you come this way?" And she began once more to cry. But at that moment Richard caught hold of a branch above his head, and reaching down his other hand, got hold of Alice, and held her till she had recovered a little. In a few moments more they reached the fork of the tree, and there they sat and rested. "This is capital," said Richard cheerily. "What is?" asked Alice sulkily. "Why, we have room to rest, and there's no hurry for a minute or two. I'm tired." "You selfish creature," said Alice. "If you are tired, what must I be?" "Tired too," answered Richard, "but we've got on bravely, and look, what's that?" By this time the day was gone and the night so near that in the shadows of the tree all was dusky and dim, but there was still light enough to discover that in a niche of the tree sat a huge horned owl with green spectacles on his beak and a book in one foot. He took no heed of the intruders, but kept muttering to himself, and what do you think the owl was saying? I will tell you. He was talking about the book that he held upside down in his foot. "Stupid book this! Nothing in it at all, everything upside down. Stupid ass! Says owls can't read, I can read backwards." "I think that is the goblin again," said Richard in a whisper. "However, if you ask a plain question, he must give you a plain answer, for they are not allowed to tell downright lies in Fairyland." "Don't ask him, Richard. You know you gave him a dreadful blow." "I gave him what he deserved, and he owes me the same. Hello! Which is the way out?" He wouldn't say "if you please," because then it would not have been a plain question. "Downstairs," hissed the owl without ever lifting his eyes from the book, which all the time he read upside down, so learned was he. "On your honour as a respectable old owl?" asked Richard. "No," hissed the owl, and Richard was almost sure that he was not really an owl. So he stood staring at him for a few moments, when all at once, without lifting his eyes from the book, the owl said, "I will sing a song," and began. "Nobody knows the world but me. When they're all in bed, I sit up to see. I'm a better student than students all, for I never read till the darkness fall. And I never read without my glasses, and that is how my wisdom passes. Howl, owl, wool, hool, wool, wool. I can see the wind. Now who can do that? I see the dreams that he has in his hat. I see him snorting them out as he goes, out at his stupid old trumpet nose. 10,000 things that you couldn't think, I write them down with pen and ink. Howl, owl, hool, ool, wit, tit, tit, that's wit. You may call it learning, 'tis mother wit. No one else sees the Lady Moon sit on the sea, her nest all night but the owl, hatching the boats and the long-legged fowl. When the oysters gape to sing by rote, she crams a pearl down each stupid throat. Howl, owl, wit, it, that's wit, there's a fowl. And so singing, he threw the book in Richard's face, spread out his great silent soft wings, and sped away into the depths of the tree. When the book struck Richard, he found that it was only a lump of wet moss. While talking to the owl, he had spied a hollow behind one of the branches. Judging this to be the way the owl meant, he went to see, and found a rude, ill-defined staircase going down into the very heart of the trunk. But so large was the tree that this could not have hurt it in the least. Down this stair then Richard scrambled as best he could, followed by Alice, not of her own will. She gave him clearly to understand, but because she could do no better. Down, down they went, slipping and falling sometimes, but never very far, because the stair went round and round. It caught Richard when he slipped, and he caught Alice when she did. They had begun to fear that there was no end to the stair. It went round and round so steadily, when creeping through a crack, they found themselves in a great hall, supported by thousands of pillars of grey stone. Where the little light came from they could not tell. This hall they began to cross in a straight line, hoping to reach one side, and intending to walk along it till they came to some opening. They kept straight by going from pillar to pillar, as they had done before by the trees. Any honest plan will do in Fairyland if you only stick to it, and no plan will do if you do not stick to it. It was very silent, and Alice disliked the silence more than the dimness, so much indeed that she longed to hear Richard's voice. But she had always been so cross to him when he had spoken that he thought it better to let her speak first, and she was too proud to do that. She would not even let him walk alongside of her, but always went slower when he wanted to wait for her, so that at last he strode on alone, and Alice followed. But by degrees the horror of silence grew upon her, and she felt at last as if there were no one in the universe but herself. The hall went on widening around her. Their footsteps made no noise. The silence grew so intense that it seemed on the point of taking shape. At last she could bear it no longer. She ran after Richard, got up with him, and laid hold of his arm. He had been thinking for some time what an obstinate, disagreeable girl Alice was, and wishing he had her safe home to be rid of her, when, feeling a hand and looking round, he saw that it was the disagreeable girl. She soon began to be companionable after a fashion, for she began to think, putting everything together, that Richard must have been several times in Fairyland before now. "It is very strange," she said to herself, "for he is quite a poor boy. I am sure of that. His arms stick out beyond his jacket like the ribs of his mother's umbrella. And to think of me wandering about Fairyland with him!" The moment she touched his arm, they saw an arch of blackness before them. They had walked straight to a door, not a very inviting one, for it opened upon an utterly dark passage. Where there was only one door, however, there was no difficulty about choosing. Richard walked straight through it, and from the greater fear of being left behind, Alice faced the lesser fear of going on. In a moment they were in total darkness. Alice clung to Richard's arm and murmured, almost against her will, "Dear Richard." It was strange that fear should speak like love, but it was in Fairyland. It was strange, too, that as soon as she spoke thus, Richard should fall in love with her all at once. But what was more curious still was that, at the same moment, Richard saw her face. In spite of her fear, which had made her pale, she looked very lovely. "Dear Alice," said Richard, "how pale you look." "How can you tell that, Richard, when all is as black as pitch?" "I can see your face, it gives out light. Now I see your hands. Now I can see your feet. Yes, I can see every spot where you are going to... No, don't put your foot there. There is an ugly toad just there." The fact was that the moment he began to love Alice, his eyes began to send forth light. What he thought came from Alice's face really came from his eyes. All about her and her path he could see, and every minute saw better. But to his own path he was blind. He could not see his hand when he held it straight before his face, so dark was it. But he could see Alice, and that was better than seeing the way, ever so much. At length, Alice too began to see a face dawning through the darkness. It was Richard's face, but it was far handsomer than when she saw it last. Her eyes had begun to give light too, and she said to herself, "Can it be that I love the poor widow's son? I suppose that must be it," she answered herself with a smile, for she was not disgusted with herself at all. Richard saw the smile and was glad. Her paleness had gone, and a sweet rosiness had taken its place, and now she saw Richard's path as he saw hers, and between the two sights they got on well. They were now walking on a path betwixt two deep waters which never moved, shining as black as ebony where the eyelight fell. But they saw ere long that this path kept growing narrower and narrower. At last, to Alice's dismay, the black waters met in front of them. "What is to be done now, Richard?" she said. When they fixed their eyes on the water before them, they saw that it was swarming with lizards and frogs and black snakes and all kinds of strange and ugly creatures, especially some that had neither heads nor tails, nor legs nor fins nor feelers, being, in fact, only living lumps. These kept jumping out and in and sprawling upon the path. Richard thought for a few moments before replying to Alice's question, as indeed well he might, but he came to the conclusion that the path could not have gone on for the sake of stopping there, and that it must be a kind of finger that pointed on where it was not allowed to go itself. So he caught up Alice in his strong arms and jumped into the middle of the horrid swarm. And just as minnows vanish if you throw anything amongst them, just so these wretched creatures vanished, right and left and every way. He found the water broader than he had expected, and before he got over, he found Alice heavier than he could have believed. But upon a firm, rocky bottom, Richard waded through in safety. When he reached the other side, he found that the bank was a lofty, smooth, perpendicular rock, with some rough steps cut in it. By and by the steps led them right into the rock, and they were in a narrow passage once more, but this time leading up. It wound round and round like the thread of a great screw. At last Richard knocked his head against something and could go no further. The place was close and hot. He put up his hands and pushed what felt like a warm stone. It moved a little. "Go down, you brutes," growled a voice above, quivering with anger. "You'll upset my pot and my cat and my temper too if you push that way. Go down." Richard knocked very gently and said, "Please let us out." "Oh yes, I dare say, very fine and soft-spoken. Go down, you goblin brutes. I've had enough of you. I'll scald the hair off your ugly heads if you do that again. Go down, I say." Seeing fair speech was of no avail, Richard told Alice to go down a little, out of the way, and setting his shoulders to one end of the stone, heaved it up, whereupon down came the other end, with a pot and a fire, and a cat which had been asleep beside it. She frightened Alice dreadfully as she rushed past her, showing nothing but her green lamping eyes. Richard, peeping up, found that he had turned a hearthstone upside down. On the edge of the hole stood a little crooked old man, brandishing a mop-stick in a tremendous rage, and hesitating only where to strike him. But Richard put him out of his difficulty by springing up and taking the stick from him. Then, having lifted Alice out, he returned it with a bow, and heedless of the maledictions of the old man, proceeded to get the stone and the pot up again. For Puss, she got out herself. Then the old man became a little more friendly and said, "I beg your pardon, I thought you were goblins. They never will let me alone, but you must allow it was rather an unusual way of paying a morning call." And the creature bowed conciliatingly. "It was indeed," answered Richard. "I wish you had turned the door to us instead of the hearthstone." For he did not trust the old man. "But," he added, "I hope you will forgive us." "Oh, certainly, certainly, my dear young people. Use your freedom. But such young people have no business to be out alone. It is against the rules." "But what is one to do? I mean two to do when they can't help it?" "Yes, yes, of course, but now you know, I must take charge of you. So you sit there, young gentleman, and you sit there, young lady." He put a chair for one at one side of the hearth, and for the other at the other side, and then drew his chair between them. The cat got upon his hump and then set up her own. So here was a wall that would let through no moonshine. But although both Richard and Alice were very much amused, they did not like to be parted in this peremptory manner. Still, they thought it better not to anger the old man any more, in his own house too. But he had been once angered, and that was once too often, for he had made it a rule never to forgive without taking it out in humiliation. It was so disagreeable to have him sitting there between them that they felt as if they were far asunder. In order to get the better of the fancy, they wanted to hold each other's hand behind the dwarf's back. But the moment their hands began to approach, the back of the cat began to grow long, and its hump to grow high, and in a moment more Richard found himself crawling wearily up a steep hill, whose ridge rose against the stars, while a cold wind blew drearily over it. Not a habitation was in sight, and Alice had vanished from his eyes. He felt, however, that she must be somewhere on the other side, and so climbed and climbed to get over the brow of the hill and down to where he thought she must be. But the longer he climbed, the farther off the top of the hill seemed, till at last he sank, quite exhausted, and, must I confess it, very nearly began to cry. To think of being separated from Alice all at once, and in such a disagreeable way! But he fell a-thinking instead, and soon said to himself, "This must be some trick of that wretched old man. Either this mountain is a cat, or it is not. If it is a mountain, this won't hurt it. If it is a cat, I hope it will." With that, he pulled out his pocket-knife, and feeling for a soft place, drove it at one blow up to the handle in the side of the mountain. A terrific shriek was the first result, and the second that Alice and he sat looking at each other across the old man's hump, from which the Catamountain had vanished. Their host sat staring at the blank fireplace without ever turning round, pretending to know nothing of what had taken place. "Come along, Alice," said Richard, rising. "This won't do. We won't stop here." Alice rose at once and put her hand in his. they walked towards the door. The old man took no notice of them. The moon was shining brightly through the window, but instead of stepping out into the moonlight when they opened the door, they stepped into a great, beautiful hall, through the high Gothic windows of which the same moon was shining. Out of this hall they could find no way except by a staircase of stone which led upwards. They ascended it together. At the top Alice let go Richard's hand to peep into a little room which looked all the colours of the rainbow, just like the inside of a diamond. Richard went a step or two along a corridor, but finding she had left him, turned and looked into the chamber. He could see her nowhere. The room was full of doors, and she must have mistaken the door. He heard her voice calling him, and hurried in direction of the sound, but he could see nothing of her. More tricks, he said to himself. It is of no use to stab this one. I must wait till I see what can be done. Still he heard Alice calling him, and still he followed, as well as he could. At length he came to a doorway, open to the air, through which the moonlight fell. But when he reached it, he found that it was high up in the side of a tower, the wall of which went straight down from his feet, without stair or descent of any kind. Again he heard Alice call him, and lifting his eyes saw her across a wide castle court, standing at another door just like the one he was at, with the moon shining full upon her. "All right, Alice," he cried. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," answered she. "Then listen. This is all a trick. It is all a lie of that old wretch in the kitchen. Just reach out your hand, Alice dear." Alice did as Richard asked her, and although they saw each other many yards off across the court, their hands met. "There, I thought so," exclaimed Richard triumphantly. "Now, Alice, I don't believe it is more than a foot or two down to the court below, though it looks like 100 feet. Keep fast hold of my hand and jump when I count 3. But Alice drew her hand from him in sudden dismay, whereupon Richard said, "Well, I will try first," and jumped. The same moment his cheery laugh came to Alice's ears, and she saw him standing safe on the ground far below. "Jump, dear Alice, and I will catch you," said he. "I can't. I'm afraid," answered she. "The old man is somewhere near you. You had better jump," said Richard. Alice sprang from the wall in terror, and only fell a foot or two into Richard's arms. The moment she touched the ground, they found themselves outside the door of a little cottage, which they knew very well, for it was only just within the wood that bordered on their village. Hand in hand they ran home as fast as they could. When they reached a little gate that led into her father's grounds, Richard bade Alice goodbye. The tears came in her eyes. Richard and she seemed to have grown quite man and woman in Fairyland, and they did not want to part now, but they felt that they must. So Alice ran in the back way and reached her own room before anyone had missed her. Indeed, the last of the red had not quite faded from the west. As Richard crossed the marketplace on his way home, he saw an umbrella man just selling the last of his umbrellas. He thought the man gave him a queer look as he passed, and felt very much inclined to punch his head. But remembering how useless it had been to punch the goblin's head, he thought it better not. In reward of their courage, the Fairy Queen sent them permission to visit Fairyland as often as they pleased, and no goblin or fairy was allowed to interfere with them. For Peaseblossom and Toadstool, they were both banished from court and compelled to live together for 7 years in an old tree that had just one green leaf upon it. Toadstool did not mind it much, but Peaseblossom did. End of section 4. End of Cross Purposes. Section 5 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts. Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. Section 5. The Carason. Chapter 1. The Mountain Stream. Once upon a time there lived in a valley in Scotland a boy about 12 years of age, the son of a shepherd. His mother was dead and he had no sister or brother. His father was out all day on the hills with his sheep, but when he came home at night, he was as sure of finding the cottage neat and clean, the floor swept, a bright fire, and his supper waiting for him, as if he had had a wife and daughter to look after his household, instead of only a boy. Therefore, although Colin could only read and write, he knew nothing of figures. He was 10 times wiser and more capable of learning anything than if he had been at school all his days. He was never at a loss when anything had to be done. Somehow he always blundered into the straight road to his end, while another would be putting on his shoes to look for it. And yet all the time that he was busiest working, he was busiest building castles in the air. I think the two ought always to go together. And so Colin was never overworked, but had plenty of time to himself. In winter, he spent it in reading by the fireside, or carving pieces of wood with his pocket knife. And in summer he always went out for a ramble. His great delight was in a little stream which ran down the valley from the mountains above. Up this burn he would wander every afternoon with his hands in his pockets. He never got far, however, he was so absorbed in watching its antics. Sometimes he would sit on a rock, staring at the water as it hurried through the stones, scolding, expostulating, muttering, and always having its own way. Sometimes he would stop by a deep pool and watch the crimson-spotted trouts darting about as if their thoughts and not their tails sent them where they wanted to go. And when he stopped at the little cascade, tumbling smooth and shining over a hollowed rock, he seldom got beyond it. But there was one thing which always troubled him. It was that when the stream came near the cottage, it could find no other way than through the little yard where stood the cow-house and the pigsty, and there, not finding a suitable channel, spread abroad in a disconsolate manner, becoming rather a puddle than a brook, all defiled with the treading of the cloven feet of the cow and the pigs. In fact, it looked quite lost and ruined, so that even after it had, with much labour, got out of the yard again, it took a long time to gather itself together, and not quite succeeding, slipped away as if ashamed, with spent forces and poverty-stricken speed, till at length, meeting the friendly help of a rivulet coming straight from the hills, it gathered heart and bounded on afresh. "It can't be all that the cow drinks that makes the difference," said Colin to himself. "The pigs don't care about it. I do believe it's affronted at being dashed about. The cow isn't dirty, but she's rather stupid and inconsiderate. The pigs are dirty. Something must be done. Let me see." He reconnoitred the whole ground. Upon the other side of the house all was rock, through which he could not cut, and he was forced to the conclusion that the only other course for the stream to take lay right through the cottage. To most engineers this would have appeared the one course to be avoided, but Colin's heart danced at the thought of having his dear burn running right through the house. How cool it would be all the summer, how convenient for cooking, and how handy at meals, and then the music of it. How it would tell him stories and sing him to sleep at night. What a companion it would be when his father was away, and then he could bathe in it when he liked. In winter, to be sure, but winter was a long way off. The very next day his father went to the fair, so Colin set to work at once. It was not such a very difficult undertaking, for the walls of the cottage and the floor as well were of clay, the former nearly sun-dried into a brick, and the latter trampled hard, but still both assailable by pickaxe and spade. He cut through the walls and dug a channel along the floor, letting in stones in the bottom and sides. After it got out of the cottage and through the small garden in front, it should find its own way to the channel below, for here the hill was very steep. The same evening his father came home. "What have you been about, Colin?" he asked in great surprise when he saw the trench in the floor. "Wait a minute, father," said Colin, "till I have got your supper, and then I'll tell you." So when his father was seated at the table, Colin darted out, and hurrying up to the stream, broke through the bank just in the place whence a natural hollow led straight to the cottage. The stream dashed out like a wild creature from a cage, faster than he could follow, and shot through the wall of the cottage. His father gave a shout, and when Colin went in, he found him sitting with his spoon halfway to his mouth, and his eyes fixed on the muddy water which rushed foaming through his floor. "It will soon be clean, father," said Colin, "and then it will be so nice." His father made no answer, but continued staring. Colin went on with a long list of the advantages of having a brook running through your house. At length his father smiled and said, "You are a curious creature, Colin, but why shouldn't you have your fancies as well as older people? We'll try it a while, and then we'll see about it." The fact was, Colin's father had often thought what a lonely life the boy's was, and it seemed hard to take from him any pleasure he could have. So out rushed Colin at the front to see how the brook would take the shortest way headlong down the hill to its old channel. And to see it go tumbling down that hill was a sight worth living for. "It is a mercy," said Colin. "It has no neck to break, or it would break 20 times in a minute. It flings itself from rock to rock right down, just as I should like to do if it weren't for my neck." All that evening he was out and in without a moment's rest, now up to the beginning of the cut, now following the stream down to the cottage, then through the cottage and out again at the front door to see it dart across the garden and dash itself down the hill. At length his father told him he must go to bed. He took one more peep at the water, which was running quite clear now, and obeyed. His father followed him presently. End of Section 5. Section 6 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. The Carason. Chapter 2. The Fairy Fleet. The bed was about a couple of yards from the edge of the brook, and as Colin was always first up in the morning, he slept at the front of the bed. So he lay for some time, gazing at the faint glimmer of the water in the dull red light from the sod-covered fire, and listening to its sweet music as it hurried through to the night again, till its murmur changed into a lullaby and sung him fast asleep. Soon he found that he was coming awake again. He was lying listening to the sound of the busy stream, but it had gathered more sounds since he went to sleep amongst the rest, one of the boards knocking together, and a tiny chattering and sweet laughter, like the tinkling of heather bells. He opened his eyes. The moon was shining along the brook, lighting the smoky rafters above with its reflection from the water, which had been dammed back at its outlet from the cottage, so that it lay bank full and level with the floor. But its surface was hardly to be seen, save by an occasional glimmer, for the crowded boats of a fairy fleet which had just arrived. The sailors were as busy as sailors could be, mooring along the banks, or running their boats high and dry on the shore. Some had little sails which glimmered white in the moonshine, half lowered, or blowing out in the light breeze that crept down the course of the stream. Some were pulling about through the rest, oars flashing, tiny voices calling, tiny feet running, tiny hands hauling at ropes that ran through blocks of shining ivory. On the shore stood groups of fairy ladies in all colours of the rainbow, green predominating, waited upon by gentlemen all in green, but with red and yellow feathers in their caps. The Queen had landed on the side next to Colin, and in a few minutes 20 dances were going at once along the shores of the fairy river. And there lay great Colin's face, just above the bedclothes, glowering at them like an ogre. At last, after a few dances, he heard a clear, sweet, ringing voice say, "I've had enough of this. I'm tired of doing like the big people. Let's have a game of hey cockalorum jig." That instant every group sprang asunder, and every fairy began a frolic on his own account. They scattered all over the cottage, and Colin lost sight of most of them. While he lay watching the antics of 2 of those near him, who behaved more like clowns at a fair than the gentlemen they had been a little while before, he heard a voice close to his ear, but though he looked everywhere about his pillow, he could see nothing. The voice stopped the moment he began to look, but began again as soon as he gave it up. "You can't see me. I'm talking to you through a hole in the head of your bed." "Don't look," said the voice. "If the Queen sees me, I shall be pinched. Oh, please don't." The voice sounded as if its owner would cry presently, so Colin took great care not to look. It went on. "Please, I am a little girl, not a fairy. The Queen stole me the minute I was born, 7 years ago, and I can't get away. I don't like the fairies. They are so silly, and they never grow any wiser. I grow wiser every year. I want to get back to my own people. They won't let me. They make me play at being somebody else all night long and sleep all day. That's what they do themselves, and I should so like to be myself. The Queen says that's not the way to be happy at all, but I do want very much to be a little girl. Do take me." "How am I to get you?" asked Colin in a whisper, which sounded, after the sweet voice of the changeling, like the wind in a field of dry beans. "The Queen is so pleased with you that she is sure to offer you something. Choose me. Here she comes." Immediately he heard another voice, shriller and stronger, in front of him, and looking about, saw standing on the edge of the bed a lovely little creature, with a crown glittering with jewels, and a rush for a sceptre in her hand, the blossom of which shone like a bunch of garnets. "You great staring creature," she said, "your eyes are much too big to see with. What clumsy hobgoblins you thick folk are." So saying, she laid her wand across Colin's eyes. "Now then, stupid," she said, and that instant Colin saw the room like a huge barn, full of creatures about 2 feet high. The beams overhead were crowded with fairies, playing all imaginable tricks, scrambling everywhere, knocking each other over, throwing dust and soot in each other's faces, grinning from behind corners, dropping on each other's necks and tripping up each other's heels. 2 had got hold of an empty eggshell, and coming behind one sitting on the edge of the table and laughing at someone on the floor, tumbled it right over him so that he was lost in the cavernous hollow. But the lady fairies mingled in none of these rough pranks. Their tricks were always graceful, and they had more to say than to do. But the moment the Queen had laid her wand across his eyes, she went on. "Know, son of a human mortal, that thou hast pleased a Queen of the Fairies. Lady as I am over the elements, I cannot have everything I desire. One thing thou hast given me. Years have I longed for a path down this rivulet to the ocean below. Your horrid farmyard, ever since your great-grandfather built this cottage, was the one obstacle. For we fairies hate dirt, not only in houses but in fields and woods as well, and above all in running streams. But I can't talk like this any longer. I tell you what, you are a dear good boy, and you shall have what you please. Ask me for anything you like." "May it please your Majesty," said Colin very deliberately, "I want a little girl that you carried away some 7 years ago the moment she was born. May it please your Majesty." "I want her." "It does not please my Majesty," cried the Queen, whose face had been growing very black. "Ask for something else." "Then whether it pleases your Majesty or not," said Colin bravely, "I hold your Majesty to your word. I want that little girl, and that little girl I will have, and nothing else." "You dare to talk so to me, you thick?" "Yes, your Majesty." "Then you shan't have her." "Then I'll turn the brook right through the dunghill," said Colin. "Do you think I'll let you come into my cottage to play at high-jinks when you please, if you behave to me like this?" And Colin sat up in bed and looked the Queen in the face. And as he did so, he caught sight of the loveliest little creature peeping round the corner at the foot of the bed. And he knew she was the little girl because she was quiet and looked frightened and was sucking her thumb. Then the Queen, seeing with whom she had to deal, and knowing that queens in Fairyland are bound by their word, began to try another plan with him. She put on her sweetest manner and looks, and as she did so, the little face at the foot of the bed grew more troubled, and the little head shook itself, and the little thumb dropped out of the little mouth. "Dear Colin," said the Queen, "you shall have the girl, but you must do something for me first." The little girl shook her head as fast as ever she could, but Colin was taken up with the Queen. "To be sure I will. What is it?" he said. And so he was bound by a new bargain, and was in the Queen's power. "You must fetch me a bottle of Carason," said she. "What is that?" asked Colin. "A kind of wine that makes people happy." "Why, are you not happy already?" "No, Colin," answered the Queen with a sigh. "You have everything you want." "Except the Carason," returned the Queen. "You do whatever you like and go wherever you please." "That's just it. I want something that I neither like nor please, that I don't know anything about. I want a bottle of Carason." And here she cried like a spoilt child, not like a sorrowful woman. "But how am I to get it?" "I don't know. You must find out." "Oh, that's not fair," cried Colin. But the Queen burst into a fit of laughter that sounded like the bells of 100 frolicking sheep, and bounding away to the side of the river, jumped on board of her boat, and like a swarm of bees gathered the courtiers and sailors, 2 creeping out of the bellows, 1 at the nozzle and the other at the valve, 3 out of the basket hilt of the broadsword on the wall, 6 all white out of the meal tub, and so from all parts of the cottage to the riverside. And amongst them Colin spied the little girl creeping on board the Queen's boat, with her pinafore to her eyes, and the Queen was shaking her fist at her. In 5 minutes more they had all scrambled into the boats, and the whole fleet was in motion down the stream. In another moment the cottage was empty, and everything had returned to its usual size. "They'll be all dashed to pieces on the rocks," cried Colin, jumping up and running into the garden. When he reached the fall, there was nothing to be seen but the swift plunge and rush of the broken water in the moonlight. He thought he heard cries and shouts coming up from below, and fancied he could distinguish the sobs of the little maiden whom he had so foolishly lost. But the sounds might be only those of the water, for to the different voices of a running stream there is no end. He followed its course all the way to its old channel, but saw nothing to indicate any disaster. Then he crept back to his bed, where he lay thinking what a fool he had been, till he cried himself to sleep over the little girl who would never grow into a woman. End of Section 6. Section 7 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. The Carason, Chapter 3. The Old Woman and Her Hen. In the morning, however, his courage had returned, for the word Carason was always saying itself in his brain. People in fairy stories, he said, always find what they want. Why should not I find this Carason? It does not seem likely, but the world doesn't go round by likely, so I will try. But how was he to begin? When Colin did not know what to do, he always did something. So as soon as his father was gone to the hill, he wandered up the stream down which the fairies had come. "But I needn't go on so," he said, "for if the Carason grew in the fairies' country, the Queen would know how to get it." All at once he remembered how he had lost himself on the moor when he was a little boy, and had gone into a hut and found there an old woman spinning. And she had told him such stories and shown him the way home. So he thought she might be able to help him now, for he remembered that she was very old then, and must be older and still wiser now. And he resolved to go and look for the hut, and ask the old woman what he was to do. So he left the stream and climbed the hill, and soon came upon a desolate moor. The sun was clouded, and the wind was cold, and everything looked dreary, and there was no sign of a hut anywhere. He wandered on, looking for it, and all at once found that he had forgotten the way back. At the same instant he saw the hut right before him, and then he remembered it was when he had lost himself that he saw it the former time. "It seems the way to find some things is to lose yourself," said he to himself. He went up to the cottage, which was like a large beehive built of turf, and knocked at the door. "Come in, Colin," said a voice, and he entered, stooping low. The old woman sat by a little fire, spinning after the old fashion, with a distaff and spindle. She stopped the moment he went in. "Come and sit down by the fire," she said, "and tell me what you want." Then Colin saw that she had no eyes. "I am very sorry you are blind," he said. "Never you mind that, my dear. I see more than you do for all my blindness. Tell me what you want, and I shall see at least what I can do for you." "How do you know I want anything?" asked Colin. "Now that's what I don't like," said the old woman. "Why do you waste words? Words should not be wasted any more than crumbs." "I beg your pardon," returned Colin. "I will tell you all about it." And so he told her the whole story. "Oh, those children," said the old woman. "They are always doing some mischief. They never know how to enjoy themselves without hurting somebody or other. I really must give that queen a bit of my mind. Well, my dear, I like you, and I will tell you what must be done. You shall carry the silly queen her bottle of Carason, but she won't like it when she gets it, I can tell her. That's my business. However, first of all, Colin, you must dream 3 days without sleeping. Next, you must work 3 days without dreaming. And last, you must work and dream 3 days together. How am I to do all that? I will help you all I can, but a great deal will depend on yourself. In the meantime, you must have something to eat. So saying, she rose, and going to a corner behind her bed, returned with a large golden-coloured egg in her hand. This she laid on the hearth, and covered over with hot ashes. She then chatted away to Colin about his father and the sheep, and the cow and the housework, and showed that she knew all about him. At length she drew the ashes off the egg, and put it on the plate. It shines like silver now, said Colin. That is a sign it is quite done, said she, and set it before him. Colin had never tasted anything half so nice, and he had never seen such a quantity of meat in an egg. Before he had finished it, he had made a hearty meal. But in the meantime, the old woman said, "Shall I tell you a story while you have your dinner?" "Oh, yes, please do," answered Colin. "You told me such stories before." "Jenny," said the old woman, "my wool is all done. Get me some more." And from behind the bed out came a sober-coloured but large and beautifully shaped hen. She walked sedately across the floor, putting down her feet daintily, like a prim matron as she was, and stopping by the door, gave a cluck-cluck. "Oh, the door is shut, is it?" said the old woman. "Let me open it," said Colin. "Do, my dear." "What are all those white things?" he asked, for the cottage stood in the middle of a great bed of grass with white tops. "Those are my sheep," said the old woman. "You will see." Into the grass Jenny walked, and stretching up her neck, gathered the white woolly stuff in her beak. When she had as much as she could hold, she came back and dropped it on the floor, then picked the seeds out and swallowed them, and went back for more. The old woman took the wool, and fastening it on her distaff, began to spin, giving the spindle a twirl, and then dropping it and drawing out the thread from the distaff. But as soon as the spindle began to twirl, it began to sparkle all the colours of the rainbow, that it was a delight to see. And the hands of the woman, instead of being old and wrinkled, were young and long-fingered and fair, and they drew out the wool, and the spindle spun and flashed, and the hen kept going out and in, bringing wool and swallowing the seeds, and the old woman kept telling Colin one story after another, till he thought he could sit there all his life and listen. Sometimes it seemed the spindle that was flashing them, sometimes the long fingers that were spinning them, and sometimes the hen that was gathering them off the roads of the long dry grass and bringing them in her beak and laying them down on the floor. All at once the spindle grew slower and gradually ceased turning. The fingers stopped drawing out the thread, the hen retreated behind the bed, and the voice of the blind woman was silent. "I suppose it is time for me to go," said Colin. "Yes, it is," answered his hostess. "Please tell me then, how am I to dream 3 days without sleeping?" "That's over," said the old woman. "You've just finished that part. I told you I would help you all I could." "Have I been here 3 days then?" asked Colin in astonishment. "And nights too, and I and Jenny and the spindle are quite tired and want to sleep. Jenny has got 3 eggs to lay besides. Make haste, my boy." "Please, then tell me what I am to do next." "Jenny will put you in the way. When you come where you are going, you will tell them that the old woman with the spindle desires them to lift Cumberbone Crag a yard higher, and to send a flue under Stone Starvit moss. Jenny, show Colin the way." Jenny came out with a surly cluck, and led him a good way across the heath by a path only a hen could have found. But she turned suddenly and walked home again. End of Section 7. Section 8 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Fairies. Colin could just perceive something suggestive of a track, which he followed till the sun went down. Then he saw a dim light before him, keeping his eye upon which he came at last to a smithy where, looking in at the open door, he saw a huge humpbacked smith working a forehammer in each hand. He grinned out of the middle of his breast when he saw Colin and said, come in, my youngsters will be glad of you." He was an awful-looking creature with a great hare lip and a red ball for a nose. Whatever he did speak, or laugh, or sneeze, he did not stop working one moment. As often as the sparks flew in his face, he snapped at them with his eyes, which were the colour of a half-dead coal, now with this one, now with that, and the more sparks they got into them, the brighter his eyes grew. The moment Colin entered, he took a huge bar of iron from the furnace and began laying on it so with his 2 forehammers that he disappeared in a cloud of sparks, and Colin had to shut his eyes and be glad to escape with a few burns on his face and hands. When he had beaten the iron till it was nearly black, the smith put it in the fire again and called out 100 odd names. "Here, Gob, Shag, Latchet, Liquor, Freestone, Grey Wacket, Mousetrap, Potato Pot, Blob, Blotch, Blunker." And ever as he called, one dwarf after another came tumbling out of the chimney, in the corner of which the fire was roaring. They crowded about Colin and began to make hideous faces and spit fire at him, but he kept a bold countenance. At length one pinched him, and he could not stand that, but struck him hard on the head. He thought he had knocked his own hand to pieces, it gave him such a jar, and the head rung like an iron pot. Come, young man," cried the smith, "you keep your hands off my children." "Tell them to keep their hands off me then," said Colin, and calling to mind his message, just as they began to crowd about him again with yet more spiteful looks, he added, "Here, you imps, I won't stand it longer. Get to your work directly. The old woman with the spindle says you're to lift Cumberbone Crag a yard higher, and to send a flue under Stone Starvit moss." In a moment they had vanished in the chimney. In a moment more the smithy rocked to its foundations, but the smith took no notice, only worked more furiously than ever. Then came a great crack, and a shock that threw Colin on the floor. The smith reeled, but never lost hold of his hammers or missed a blow on the anvil. "Those boys will do themselves a mischief," he said, then turning to Colin. "Here, you sir, take that hammer. This is no safe place for idle people. If you don't work, you'll be knocked to pieces in no time." The same moment there came a wind from the chimney that blew all the fire into the middle of the smithy. The smith dashed up upon the forge and rushed out of sight. Presently he returned with one of the goblins under his arm, kicking and screaming, laid his ugly head down on the anvil where he held him by the neck, and hit him a great blow with his hammer above the ear. The hammer rebounded, and the goblin gave a shriek, and the smith flung him into the chimney, saying, "That's the only way to serve him. You'll be more careful for one while, I guess, Slobberkin." And thereupon he took up his other hammer and began to work again, saying to Colin, "Now, young man, as long as you get a blow with your hammer in for every one of mine, you'll be quite safe. But if you stop or lose the beat, I won't be answerable to the old woman with the spindle for the consequences." Colin took up the hammer and did his best, but he soon found that he had never known what it was to work. The smith worked a hammer in each hand, and it was all Colin could do to work his little hammer with both his hands, so it was a terrible exertion to put in blow for blow with the smith. Once, when he lost the time, the smith's forehammer came down on the head of his, beat it flat on the anvil, and flung the handle to the other end of the smithy, where it struck the wall like the report of a cannon. "I told you," said the smith. "There's another. Make haste, for the boys will be in want of you, and me too, before they get Cumberbone Crag half a foot higher." Presently in came the biggest headed of the family, out of the chimney. "6-foot wedges and a 3-yard crowbar," he said, "or Cumberbone will cumber our bones presently." The smith rushed behind the bellows, brought out a bar of iron 3 inches thick or so, cut off 3 yards, put the end in the fire, blew with might and main, and brought it out as white as paper. He and Colin then laid upon it till the end was flattened to an edge, which the smith turned up a little. He then handed the tool to the imp. "Here, Gob," he said, "run with it, and the wedges will be ready by the time you come back." Then to the wedges they set, and Colin worked like 3. He never knew how he could work before. Not a moment's pause, except when the smith was at the forge for another glowing mass. And yet, to Colin's amazement, the more he worked, the stronger he seemed to grow. Instead of being worn out, the moment he had got his breath, he wanted to be at it again, and he felt as if he had grown twice the size since he took hammer in hand. And the goblins kept running in and out all the time, now for one thing, now for another. Colin thought if they made use of all the tools they fetched, they must be working very hard indeed. And the convulsions felt in the smithy bore witness to their exertions somewhere in the neighbourhood. And the longer they worked together, the more friendly grew the smith. At length he said his words, always adding energy to his blows. "What does the old woman want to improve Stone Starvit moss for?" "I didn't know she did want to improve it," returned Colin. "Why, anybody may see that. First she wants Cumberbone Crag a yard higher, just enough to send the northeast blast over the moss without touching it. Then she wants a hot flue passed under it. Plain as a forehammer. What did you ask her to do for you? She's always doing things for people and making my bones ache." "You don't seem to mind it much, though, sir," said Colin. "No more I do," answered the smith, with a blow that drove the anvil halfway into the earth, from which it took him some trouble to drag it out again. "But I want to know what she is after now." So Colin told him all he knew about it, which was merely his own story. I see," said the smith. "It's all moonshine, but we must do as she says notwithstanding. And now it is my turn to give you a lift, for you have worked well. As soon as you leave the smithy, go straight to Stone Starvit moss. Get on the highest part of it, make a circle 3 yards across, and dig a trench round it.
I will give you a spade. At the end of the first day, you will see a vine break the earth. By the end of the second, it will be creeping all over the circle. And by the end of the third day, the grapes will be ripe. Squeeze them one by one into a bottle. I will give you a bottle till it is full. Cork it up tight, and by the time the Queen comes for it, it will be Carason.
"Oh, thank you, thank you," cried Colin. "When am I to go?"
As soon as the boys have lifted Cumberbone Crag and bored the flue under the moss. It is of no use till then.
"Well, I'll go on with my work," said Colin, and struck away at the anvil. In a minute or two in came the same goblin whose head his father had hammered, and said respectfully, "It's all right, sir. The boys are gathering their tools, and will be home to supper directly."
"Are you sure you have lifted the crag a yard?" said the smith.
"Slumpkin says it's a half-inch over the yard. Grungle says it's 3/4, but that won't matter, will it?"
"No, I dare say not. But it is much better to be accurate. Is the flue done?"
"Yes, we managed that partly in lifting the crag."
"Very well. How's your head?"
"It rings a little."
"Let it ring you a lesson then, Slobberkin, in future."
"Yes, sir."
"Now, master, you may go when you like," said the smith to Colin. "With nothing here you can eat, I am sorry to say."
"Oh, I don't mind that. I'm not very hungry, but the old woman with the spindle said I was to work 3 days without dreaming."
"Well, you haven't been dreaming, have you?"
And the smith looked quite furious as he put the question, lifting his forehammer as if he would serve Colin like Slobberkin. "No, that I haven't," answered Colin. "You took good care of that, sir." The smith actually smiled.
"Then go along," he said. "It is all right."
"But I've only worked—"
3 whole days and nights," interrupted the smith. "Get along with you. The boys will bother you if you don't. Here's your spade, and here's your bottle."
End of Section 8. Section 9 of Fantasy, Fairies and Ghosts by Various. The Carason, Chapter 5, The Moss Vineyard. Colin did not need a hint more, but was out at the smithy in a moment. He turned, however, to ask the way. There was nothing in sight but a great heap of peats which had been dug out of the moss and was standing there to dry. Could he be on Stone Starvet Moss already? The sun was just setting. He would look out for the highest point at once, so he kept climbing, and at last reached a spot whence he could see all round him for a long way. Surely that must be Cumberbone Crag looking down on him. And there at his feet lay one of Jenny's eggs, as bright as silver. And there was a little path trodden and scratched by Jenny's feet, enclosing a circle just the size the smith told him to make. He set to work at once, ate Jenny's egg, and then dug the trench. Those 3 days were the happiest he had ever known, for he understood everything he did himself, and all that everything was doing round about him. He saw what the rushes were, and why the blossom came out at the side, and why it was russet-coloured, and why the pitch was white and the skin green. And he said to himself, "If I were a rush now, that's just how I should make a point of growing." And he knew how the heather felt with its cold roots, and its head of purple bells, and the wise-looking cotton grass, which the old woman called her sheep, and the white beard of which she spun into thread. And he knew what she spun it for, namely, to weave it into lovely white cloth, of which to make nightgowns for all the good people that were like to die. For one with one of these nightgowns upon him never died, but was laid in a beautiful white bed, and the door was closed upon him, and no noise came near him, and he lay there dreaming lovely cool dreams, till the world was turned round and was ready for him to get up again and do something. He felt the wind playing with every blade of grass in his charmed circle. He felt the rays of heat shooting up from the hot flue beneath the moss. He knew the moment when the vine was going to break from the earth, and he felt the juices gathering and flowing from the roots into the grapes. And all the time he seemed at home, tending the cow, or making his father's supper, or reading a fairy tale as he sat waiting for him to come home. At length the evening of the third day arrived. Colin squeezed the rich red grapes into his bottle, corked it, shouldered his spade, and turned homewards, guided by a peak which he knew in the distance. After walking all night in the moonlight, he came at length upon a place which he recognized, and so down upon the brook which he followed home. He met his father going out with his sheep. Great was his delight to see Colin again, for he had been dreadfully anxious about him. Colin told him the whole story, and as at that time marvels were much easier to believe than they are now, Colin's father did not laugh at him, but went away to the hills thinking, while Colin went on to the cottage, where he found plenty to do, having been 9 days gone. He laid the bottle carefully away with his Sunday clothes, and set about everything just as usual. But though the fairy brook was running merrily as ever through the cottage, and although Colin watched late every night, and latest when the moon shone, no fairy fleet came glimmering and dancing in along the stream. Autumn was there at length, and cold fogs began to rise in the cottage, and so Colin turned the brook into its old course, and filled up the breaches in the walls and the channel along the floor, making all close against the blasts of winter. But he had never known such a weary winter before. He could not help constantly thinking how cold the little girl must be, and how she would be saying to herself, "I wish Colin hadn't been so silly and lost me." End of section 9.